Well, super. Thank you both for joining. As I mentioned, my name is Jill Montera with Altvia, and really excited about these roundtables. The whole idea for ESG and some of the research that I've done over the last couple of months was a mandate and request from our board to better understand the entire universe of ESG and what's going on for our clients, and make some recommendations of how can we be basically more in service to you all from an ESG perspective. And so I spent, the last couple of months doing quite a bit of research, as well as interviewing a number of our clients, looking at a number of ESG related products to just better understand the landscape. And I'd say more than anything, I'm really excited about the prospect. Certainly, there are different feelings about where folks are wanting to go from an ESG perspective. I'd say the mandate, though, for sure is coming. The investors are starting to demand it very much so. And so excited about some of the possibilities of where things, there's one more coming in, where things can go and the impact, I'd say, in this industry as we think about incorporating more ESG values across the way we run our firms, the way we look at investments and the like. So good morning, Jim. How are you today? Just joining, getting audio up. So I'd like to start out this morning with just sort of a quick introduction from everybody. Name, firm name, location, where are you based, what role are you in, and what interests you from an ESG perspective. So I'll start us off. As I mentioned, my name is Jill Montero with Altvia. I head up all of our strategic initiatives for Altvia. I've been with the firm now for over 13 years and was one of the original founders of the company. And so I've worn lots of hats and worked with many of our clients over the years. But as I mentioned, really excited to be focused more on ESG going forward. I'm based in Colorado, halfway between Denver and Boulder. And I'm passionate again about ESG, not only for how we run our business, but how we might be able to impact the private market space and what this might look like in the future. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Brian, if you could do an introduction and then pass it on to Jeff and Jim.
Absolutely. So my name is Brian. I'm with Equitable Facilities Fund. Our firm is located in New York. I'm currently based out of Ireland, not for business purposes, which is great. Okay. I'm the director of finance, and we are actually a nonprofit social investment fund. And so this is kind of the work that we do. We've been an Altvia customer for about 2 years now, and I primarily joined the call because we do a lot of work around how we measure and track our investments, and I'm curious what some folks with a different perspective think on that side, and kind of how they're tracking impact and how they're thinking about getting into the ESG space. And then fun fact for you, Jill, I used to work about 5 minutes from your
remember.
office.
Yes, I remember that. Right? Just across the way in Interlaken.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. Do you still keep in touch with all the folks over at Charter School?
Yeah, I do. Not all of them, but a fair number of them. Yeah. Okay,
great. Well, thanks, Brian. Well, thank you for joining today, and exciting to hear about your adventures in Ireland. So sounds like a good COVID change. Jeff, how about for you?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Williams. I work for a company called Triton Lake. And basically what we do is that we bring deal flow, mainly private equity across the full spectrum of private equity to professional investors and quasi-institutional investors. So by doing that, I mean, I'm the CEO at Triton Lake, so I look after our operations. And as part of that, obviously, we are very focused on making sure that we support the funds that we go to market with. So basically, we see a lot of impact investing strategies, in the market. We want to make sure that we can support them in conveying what they do, and then also from an investor perspective, we want to make sure that all the the taxonomy and the description, the classification, and the information required around impact and ESG is provided in a as standardized and clear as possible manner. I'm based in Ireland as well, actually, so that's two of us today. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Jim, how about for you?
Yeah, so I'm Jim Dorman with Sierra Ventures. We're based in the Bay Area in San Mateo, operating partner there. My interest is twofold. We'll probably be fundraising next year, and obviously, I know we'll have to answer some ESG questions from LPs or potential LPs to understand kind of what the marketplace is. Not done a lot of ESG stuff. Our investments tend to be sort of software, B2B tech, not as much ESG sensitive. And the second thing is just what advice we can give our companies, along these lines as it, becomes a, very important, topic to consider and focus on.
Great, super. Well, yeah, really appreciate it, and it's helpful. I'll try to work the context and the information that I share based on what you both or all three of you just shared. So again, happy to take this conversation in lots of different ways. So please feel free to interrupt, ask questions, and let's make this a very interactive dialogue. So just 3 requests for today around transparency, vulnerability, and confidentiality. More than anything, I think as I talk to clients during my research, and then certainly in the survey results, everybody's trying to figure this out. Lots of people don't know where to start. Lots of people are very early in the curve. And so I think the more that we can be transparent about where we are, things we've tried that haven't worked or maybe have worked, that would be great. I think the vulnerability piece too as well. I think I read something even this morning from PEI that talked about how the investors are demanding more of the information around this space. And sometimes GPs are hesitant to give it because they know the numbers aren't telling the story they like. I think that's okay. And I think, they're saying, even if the numbers aren't good, it's okay to be vulnerable and just expose what you are. It's a baseline, and then let's go from there. And then the last piece I'll mention is just confidentiality, as we're all working together and sharing our anecdotes as much as we can just retain that inside this Zoom room. I appreciate that. Again, knowing that we're all trying to run our businesses and trying to figure this out together. So agenda-wise, I'm going to start out with a survey summary. So we did send out a survey as part of the folks that signed up for this. And so I'll share with you what we learned from there. And then I'm going to go into a summary of the research that I did. And that's the research I've done over the last couple of months that I recently presented to our board. And so hopefully through some of the research around the frameworks and tools and standards and other things that are in the market, that might invoke some conversation with the group. And then I've got a couple questions posed for all of you that we'll have in the group discussion, and then I'll finish up with just any next steps and highlights for the next session. Any questions before we jump in, or any comments? Good. Okay, so the first piece is the question that was how would you rate your firm's adoption of ESG principles? So you can see there 15% are what we call the comprehensive ESG strategy. So that's the blue slice. Another 15% have some priorities with progress. That's the yellow slice. But the biggest chunk there you can see is the combination of both the red and the green. So 54% haven't started or in very early discussions. So depending on where you are in this continuum, like I said, know that you're not alone. Lots of people are really early. We actually had our first roundtable yesterday, and one of the folks mentioned that they feel like at this point it's really just a box checking exercise. They haven't started to think about it in much more of a strategic way. But I think, as all of you know, I think our European clients are much more ahead of the curve in this regard. Certainly the investors are demanding it. I've read statistics that something like 80 to 80% of investors' commitments in the last year consider ESG principles as part of those commitments. So it certainly is, it's here. I believe it's not going away. If anything, it's just going to continue to get bigger. And the other piece, I think, is just as folks are considering returns, I think a couple of years ago, and Brian, you can probably speak to this, people would say, okay, we're willing to do impact investing or think about ESG, and we're willing to take a concessionary return because of ESG. However, I'd say probably within the last 2 years, we've seen those lines cross, and the firms that are incorporating ESG principles are actually outperforming the market as well. So, I think, again, I think this is something that's here to stay. I think as folks continue to adopt, we will continue to see positive change in this regard. So any comments about these stats or just in general where each of you are on the continuum?
Not surprising. It's probably what I'd say.
Yeah, agreed. Well, and I'd be curious from the European perspective as well, what you all are seeing, both in terms of the GP firm adoption as well as what the LPs are demanding.
I mean, from my perspective, we deal a lot with a lot of our deal flow is US based, so it'd be fairly aligned to what we see there. So we do see indeed a few funds in Europe that might be more focused on impact and all that, but I would say that in terms of what we see around ESG in the process of investment engagement between investors and GPs at the moment, a lot of it is still very much at the due diligence stage of the conversation, and it's still very, very much focused on governance rather than the E and S part. So I'm actually not surprised about that 46%. I think it's fairly reflective of what we see in the market.
No, I appreciate that, Jeff. And I think it'll be interesting to see. I know one of our folks yesterday commented about potential SEC regulations that he believes are forthcoming around climate. And he mentioned that the climate disclosure rules and what he anticipates we will see in the next 6 to 12 months might drag more towards the E side of ESG. The other piece that I'm seeing just after interviewing and talking with a number of clients, kind of speaking to the G focus, is that for many of our clients, when they think about ESG, if they are in a space that's really specifically environmental, where it's energy or manufacturing or something to that degree, E is a pretty easy focus. But if they don't have that, I'm finding most clients are thinking about the G in terms of diversity and inclusion, and that those are numbers that can be easily shared regardless of sector, or if you have a portfolio that's made up of multiple sectors, that's still an easy number to look at, whether it's the firm employees or the board makeup. That's an easily reportable number. So I think, it's a fairly good place to start for folks that are getting going, to think about diversity and inclusion as a good place to start if you don't know what to do first. So curious if anybody has any thoughts or perspectives on that.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think that even if we look at our own policies within our own firm, that's definitely where we would have started as well, and we still have a lot of work to do there. So definitely, recruitment policies, we are trying to definitely bring more diversity and inclusion on the team, to benefit from having a more diverse team. We also see that, we have an interest in, from investors for teams that are diverse, in terms that we've brought to market funds that are where the GP is led. It's an entirely female team, for example. So we have seen interest in things like that. But again, a lot of it is still a due diligence kind of ticking the box exercise at this stage. And as you said, the obvious things to check is the inclusion and diversity on the teams. And in spite of that, we have to admit that most of the including ourselves, the GP teams across the board are not necessarily very diverse as it stands at the moment. So it's definitely an area where there's still a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, the market. Yeah. The sector as a whole is fairly a homogenous group of people.
It is, yes.
Yeah, yeah. No, we're definitely considering that as well. We're at I think 30% women at Altvia, but we've been as high as 50%, which is, technology and private equity. And in Colorado, we've got work to do ourselves and are definitely working to bring in more diverse employees and make it a place where people feel comfortable. So
Yeah.
a huge priority for us as well.
And I think it's also one of the areas that, particularly if you look at a buyout strategy or where you can bring in a management team and all that to make changes fairly quickly, it's an area where private equity can, affect change relatively quickly in portfolio companies as well. So it's definitely a low-hanging fruit to address those aspects of the governance for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. The second question that was on the survey was around what topics were most interesting to folks. And I think, you each mentioned sort of variations of this, but, we talk about policies, practices, and metrics. And for the most part, people were interested in all three. Although if they just selected one, metrics definitely seems to be the one of interest. So kind of what you were mentioning, Brian, how do you do the reporting on your investments and how do you move beyond just financial reporting? I always think this is kind of an interesting piece because as I talked to clients and did a whole series of interviews, policies is definitely the place people want to start, right? And so sometimes they create their own, sometimes they're hiring firms to help them create a policy. Sometimes they are looking at some of their competitors' policies and then wordsmithing it to make their own. I think it's a really logical place to start, but I think where we're going to see folks move has got to be in that number 2 with practices. So I think it's a natural inclination from people I talk to is like set your policy and then jump right to metrics and just start measuring. But if folks never put any new practices in place or don't change how they conduct themselves or how they work their operating companies, we can't expect any of the metrics to change or move. So sure, you might have a baseline, but if you really are trying to drive those metrics, what are we doing within our firms and within these portfolio companies and operating companies to help make a difference? And so, I think of these really as a 3-legged stool and encourage people to start to think more so on number 2. There's obviously a lot of talk about greenwashing, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. There's a nice quote that one of our clients said, which is, you've got to move from well-meaning to well-doing. And so many folks start out with it being well-meaning and set those policies in place. But if we don't actually start well-doing, how can we expect to make any changes in this regard? So any thoughts about that or what we found with that second question?
Yeah, I agree. We had created a policy during our last fundraise,
Okay.
but it was pretty high level. And so I think 2 and 3 are probably, tougher and require some more work.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, and it seems like, I know lots of folks, some of the very large firms are hiring, diversity, inclusion, or ESG leads. But for most of us as small to mid-sized companies, it's everybody's and nobody's job to some degree to be thinking about this. And so, like you said, Jim, that, where the rubber meets the road on this, it's a little bit tricky of who owns this and who's going to drive this forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other side of it is that the policies and the strategy is really easy and everything else is really hard. So
Yeah.
I mean, in particular with practices and metrics and figuring that out, it's doing what you would normally do plus an additional layer of work and research. So, I mean, just for us, I mean, our fund model is basically rooted in the DEI space. So we're trying to bring equitable capital to predominantly low-income minority neighborhoods in the US via investments in schools. But that's in broad terms, we're really trying to bring more equity to the capital markets. And there's small things that we're trying to do internally just with our additional efforts around DEI, just the vendors that we use. And I mean, very small things that don't even have anything to do with investment. They're really hard to change just those practices. To go from like doing a normal RFP, but then having to evaluate what the firm's DEI looks like, and like it's a lot more work. And I think that's the hard part of it, is to figure out how to do it in an effective way, knowing that you already have to do your job plus add this additional layer.
Sure. Yeah, I think you can almost think of it as concentric circles. And I like your philosophy, Brian, of starting in the middle. The smallest circle is just you, how you run your business. It's like you said, the vendors that you use, how you recruit and train and hire. That's a great place to start. Even the E side of how you run your business. You know, I know some folks are doing, purchasing carbon offsets every time they're flying to different meetings around the country or around the world. Certainly, recycling or composting or whatever it might be, energy usage, all of those things can be a piece of it. I'd say that next circle out is just like you all mentioned, it's just your operating companies. How are you incorporating that into due diligence and investment strategies? Are you looking at companies that are run by diverse teams or considering all of these factors? And then the broader circle, or the largest, is the impact then that your operating companies have on their customers and in terms of how they can impact this broader space. So I think you have to almost start with the smallest circle and build out, because it's a ocean, how do you boil the ocean on that one? It's a lot to do. Any other thoughts or perspectives about those concepts? Good. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, on the matrix, I'd be interested to, in terms of, maybe that's for Brian and Jim, but in terms of the reporting you do to investors, have you brought metrics about the impact that you're making that is, it sits outside of the traditional, I suppose, performance matrix that you would give an investor? Have you gone further in investor relations and reporting to convey that?
Yeah. I mean, I think on our side, I think the way we report impact is on how the schools that we invest in and loan money to perform, and I think that's what their demographics look like and what their academic performance looks like, which in the U.S. is measured via standardized tests. And so where I get so curious about the metrics side of it is, I think every ESG kind of subgroup is like this, but the measurement side of it is very nuanced, and to really understand it, you really have to know a lot and be willing to learn a lot. And so when I think about what we report to our investors, it's like the simplest thing we can think of, and the easiest to explain, which probably doesn't accurately reflect how we think about our investments. But if we were to do that, I don't know if anyone would understand what performance is. And so that's why I get so fascinated in this, is that the demographic side of it, the students we're serving, is very easy to describe. Their performance is pretty nuanced, and we have to keep it understandable for the investor to be able to really look at it and make sense of it.
Sure, thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah. The next question we asked about was just, what questions do you have? And you can see, there were lots of questions. This is a summary, but, around data collection and tracking. How do you get the operating companies to report back on that? Then how do you aggregate all the data from a metrics perspective? How do you incorporate it into your investment evaluation and due diligence? Again, the policies piece, and then the last piece is around certification. So my hope is that through just gathering some of this, we can use these to drive future conversations for these sessions, just as we all are trying to learn and navigate this together. And then the last question before I get into the research, is just what folks want to take away from this. And I'd say more than anything, it's really just sharing, much like we're already doing today, of what have you tried? What are you seeing? What's been helpful? What are you hearing from investors? So again, I hope we can continue to do this. Our intent is to have more like 10 or 12 folks on each of these. And again, we had a nice sign up for today, but it appears lots of folks weren't able to make it. So my hope is that going forward, we can do more of this where folks are having more regular dialogue. All right, well, let's jump in then to some of the research. And I'd be curious, how much, each of you have had experience with these different things. But again, when I was doing my research about all of the tools and the landscape out there, this is sort of what I ended up narrowing down on as the ones that were most prevalent in the private equity space, based on conversations with LPs and GPs, as well as, other vendors in the space. So I'll start out on the framework side. And I'd be curious, as I talk through these, if anybody is a signatory for any of these, but the first one is UNPRI, and I'd say that's probably the largest, certainly from a global perspective. So Jeff, I'm imagining you probably hear significant amounts about UNPRI.
Yes.
I believe yeah, all right. They've got, I think now over 7,000 signatories. I'd say at a high level, to become a signatory for UNPRI is not a cheap venture, but for the most part, I think it's a little bit of a rubber stamp. I think they're putting out some good content from a strategy level, but a little bit less actionable from what I saw and researched for actually what do I do with this information and how do I start to implement? I'll compare that then against ILPA, the third one listed there. ILPA is definitely much more US centric with, I believe, just now a couple hundred signatories. And so again, we've got clients who are signatories for both UNPRI as well as ILPA. What I really like about ILPA, even though it's a bit more US centric, is that they have very tactical frameworks and almost like a playbook that people can follow, both for ESG as well as DEI. So they give really actionable tools and references so that if you're trying to make inroads in one of these areas, they give you some things that you can actually use and implement today. And so I really liked ILPA in that way. And I'm happy to share, I took all of the frameworks that they had and synthesized it down to a couple slides. And I'm happy to share that with all of you if that would be helpful for you to see.
Sure.
Yeah, love to see it.
Okay. And then the last one, of course, is UN SDGs. And I'm guessing, Brian, this might be most applicable for you. I'd say for our folks in the impact space, they're choosing and looking at the 17 UN SDGs and then saying, okay, where do our investments or what we do align with, clean water, access to food, health of our oceans, all of those types of things. I realize it's a little bit abstract for a lot of private equity, like you were saying, Jim, if you're investing into software companies, it's hard to relate that always back to some of the UN SDGs, but I'll pause there for a second. I'm curious if anybody is signatories with any of these, or what have you found based on some of the different frameworks out there?
Yeah, I mean, we are using the SDGs icons.
Okay.
So when we bring a private equity fund or direct deal opportunity to the market, we give the opportunity to the GP to use those labels and those icons.
Okay,
Now, having said that, we haven't had that much activity around using those. We have seen a couple of GPs that have actively incorporated those icons in their marketing decks and so on, and the description of their fund. There are others that we have kind of had to prompt and say, well, you look like you have a very strong ESG proposition in your strategy, but yet you're not using those. Would you be interested? And some of them are not necessarily familiar with the SDGs. Now, one comment that we have had on this is that those goals are very much designed for, I suppose, nearly country level ambitions rather than investment focused. So
sure.
I've seen, I don't know if you folks have seen that, but the Global Impact Investing Network, GIIN, have come up with a taxonomy called IRIS Plus, IRIS Plus, and that's basically taking those SDGs and kind of making them, translating them in a taxonomy that's more relevant to investment, to the investment world. So I find that interesting, but I haven't seen yet a wide adoption of it in the market, but I'm kind of keeping an eye on it because that could be something we could use.
It's interesting. Yeah. Do you find the GIIN taxonomy, Jeff, as being pretty broad reaching, or do you feel like it's mostly focused on the impact space?
Yeah, it's mostly focused on the impact, but it's trying to at least have an equivalent to all of the SDGs and cover some additional topics that may be areas of investments. But obviously, it is very much impact impact focused.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I know. We are a registered B Corp, and so we prescribe to that, as well as,
Okay.
Gears, as well, Gears engine. So it's been interesting to watch that evolve over time. How about Jim for you, or Brian for you all? What are you thinking about from a frameworks perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously not as sophisticated as Brian and Jeff. ILPA is a pretty big, part of our business. And so
Okay, good.
we have a fair bit of interaction with our investors and ILPA. ILPA,
Good.
that's probably the biggest one for us. But I think,
Okay.
we invest globally, and we're investing in sort of emerging technologies and stuff that's starting to some of the other areas. So
Okay, great.
And then for us, we're a fairly niche organization, so we have a large chunk of, we call it equity, but it's basically a philanthropic donation that we leverage in the municipal bond markets in the US. So everything that we do is kind of in that bond framework. So we worked with an organization that does social bond verification. And so they did a couple of different things for us. So they verified that we have social bonds, and that's based off of the International Capital Markets Association and their kind of definitions around what a social bond constitutes. And then we worked with them to develop a framework for how we define that. In a second here, the afternoon light is coming in through the window. Let's get to the camera.
And is that metrics related to, Brian, or is it just verification of the intent of the bond structure?
So they do verification of the intent, but they spend a lot of time in the metrics, and then the framework that they developed for us to describe this to investors in the end report that they put together when we issue our bonds is based off of that framework, which is mostly metrics.
Okay, great. That's helpful. I guess then shifting gears, from a standards perspective, the two that seem to rise to the top based on the conversations were both SASB and TCFD. So TCFD, I think obviously for you all in Europe, that's definitely seems to be more prevalent there from clients that I talk to than what we're using in the United States. Although again, I think we're a couple of years behind here in the US, but I think that gap was going to start to shorten or be minimized. So that's definitely a biggie. SASB, for those of you that aren't familiar, they basically went through the exercise of looking at 77 different industry sectors and coming up with a standardized set of metrics that can be used with the very specific definitions of how you would track and measure. So very much like FASB from an accounting perspective, how do you report out on these metrics in a way that's standardized and consistent so that apples to apples comparisons can be made. So I find SASB to be a little bit overwhelming just based on the pure volume of data and the complexity of it. I think if you had investments that were all in one or two industries, it would make it a little bit easier. But for our clients that have a spectrum of investments across industry, it makes it a little bit trickier, or certainly our fund of funds clients even more so. But would be curious to see, are any of you using either of these standards, or are there other standards other than, Brian, the one you just mentioned, that folks are using? Okay, had you heard about those SASB and TCFD, or is this the? No. Not yet. Okay, yeah. I think, like I said, SASB is a worthwhile thing to look into. It's hard to say. I mean, with all these taxonomies, right? It's sort of a race to the top of which taxonomy is going to hold. Like I said, based on the work that SASB has put forth, I'm impressed with the content there, and building on FASB and some of the other work that they've already done. I think there's real potential there. But again, I think you have to just enter into it lightly and not try to do everything all at once, but just try to see what's there. It does give you a good place to start. And perhaps at some point the LPs are going to demand that we're all following one particular standard, but I think it's a great tool to just start to do some research. The last piece that I focused on is what other tools are out there that are doing a pretty good job. And so the first one is Preqin. And I actually anticipate we're going to start to pull some of this into our product. We just are announcing this quarter a Preqin integration for those that want to enrich data from an accounts and contact perspective. But Preqin has a fairly new ESG tool where they are starting to basically grade firms, funds and operating companies. So again, down to the operating company level, it's a little bit unclear of exactly how they're gathering that data. But I think it will be interesting as they try to assess and put a grade on particular funds, how exactly that will work. The other piece that I think is interesting with Preqin is they tried to pull sort of the best out of ILPA, UNPRI, and SASB, and then boil it down to what they consider 37 key metrics. And that's what they use regardless of company type or sector. And so I think that could be an interesting piece, again, because it's a tool that so many of our clients are already using. The Preqin one might be fairly interesting. So I have seen a demo of the product. We've had some initial discussions with their ESG team as well about potential integration into our products for our clients. The second one is MSCI. So you probably might be more familiar with that. Definitely focused specifically on the fund ratings. So a little bit more geared to your LPs, but know that your LPs might use a tool like that to look at your fund ratings as it relates to an ESG index, and then taking that grade as they decide or think about what firms they're wanting to invest in. So that sort of rose to the top for me as well. And then the last one is done Bradstreet, and again, also a fairly new tool similar to Preqin. And they basically give a rating to both public and privately held companies. And so they are trying to go through and assess an overall ESG rating for these companies. So again, it could be a tool you could use with due diligence, or know that other folks might be leveraging that data as they are evaluating potential investment opportunities. So again, happy to share. This is obviously a high level summary, but if you want to dive deeper into any one of these, happy to share the research that I did or the conversations that I had with other clients. Happy to be helpful in any way.
Yeah, and Jill, quick question. I know of Preqin, but we subscribe to PitchBook, CB Insights. Is there
Sure.
any difference between those two and Preqin? In other words, why did you pick them to potentially put into your product?
Yeah, no, we definitely are looking for the PitchBook piece. There is PitchBook integration already
Right.
to some degree, So PitchBook being more focused on the companies themselves, and Preqin probably being a little bit more focused on the investor base. Okay. So we've started there, but know that those are conversations, Jim, that we're having as well. Less so with CB Insights, but certainly for PitchBook and Preqin, probably the two most used tools for our clients that we're looking from the integration perspective. Okay. Good question. Any other thoughts or comments or questions about this? Okay. So, I'll just finish up with some of the takeaways, and I think we've highlighted some of these. But again, the first piece is that investors want change. This is not going to go away. They do want to see well-meaning to well-doing. They want to stop seeing firms greenwash by just publishing data that looks like it might be good or like they're making inroads or progress on the ESG perspective, but really not. And I'd say that key here is, I do think the quantitative metrics are very helpful. And if you can start to set standards and frameworks that you're using there, that's great. The other piece that I've heard as I talk to a lot of our LP clients is they actually really appreciate the qualitative stuff that's being done as well. So kind of, Brian, to your point where, could you track number of students, schools and test scores? Yes. But if sometimes the anecdotes and the stories of what folks are doing are as interesting for the investors as well. So, again, I don't think we all need to kind of boil the ocean on this, but anything folks can do, start small, put some effort into doing one or two things really well. I think it will go a long way, and then build upon that momentum as you continue to broaden the scope. The second piece, like we talked about, is that it does need to be multifaceted. I think the tolerance for just putting a policy in place and slapping it up on your website is not going to last too much longer. Folks and investors are demanding more movement towards 2 and 3. And then the last piece, again, is that there are lots of folks out there trying to figure this out, lots of frameworks, lots of consultants, lots of products. So I am also trying to kind of keep on top of what's there just to help distill it down for all of you. But there are a lot of folks doing good work and a lot of things that can, I think, fast track some of your ESG work because you can leverage some of these tools out in the marketplace. So let's move then to kind of the group discussion. So, some of these things we've already talked about in terms of sort of frameworks and tools. So maybe we move on more so to that second question to start, which is, what's one thing that you've done well for your ESG strategy, or you've done for your ESG strategy that's worked well? Any particular stories folks can share or things they've tried?
Yeah, I mean, from our end, I mean, granted, this is really the work that we do, but what I would say that might be helpful for the rest of the group is that we started off with a concept for how we wanted to run our impact fund, and we went very conservative in the beginning. So invested in groups that maybe had a little bit lower impact, but we knew would perform well financially, and got investors comfortable with those results, and then kind of progressively moved more and more towards higher impact. And I just think in a way where, this is hard work. There's either not as good data, no data, or just kind of inconsistent data in what's available, or it's non-standardized. I mean, just if we look at, right, there's this race between all these different organizations for how the frameworks are going to look at. I mean, I just think it means that the data is hard to look at and inconsistent. And so we started out being more conservative, and with a plan that we would do that and eventually be able to invest in things that were higher impact, but maybe not quite as financially conservative. And I think that strategy has worked really well for us so far. And then, I don't think the financial results have changed at all, but investors were a lot more comfortable with it. And it allowed us to kind of get that planted before we started to make kind of big statement investments.
Okay, great. For you, Jeff and Jim.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay. You go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Just real quick, we've created a DEI committee within the firm, and our head of marketing actually leads it and has objectives around it. And then we've, in addition to doing sort of DEI events for the firm once a quarter, more educational in nature, we've done a couple webinars for our companies on just sort of best practices and things they should think about. It's a little tricky. We have a lot of seed companies that have maybe 10 or 15 people, so it's tougher to sort of mandate extensive ESG/DEI reporting. They're just trying to hire people and build product, but
yeah, sure.
The point for us is get them thinking about it early in the cycle. So that's kind of what we do.
Good. And how, from an internal side, are you working to incorporate some of that into the hiring and growth of the firm, or more focused just on the education piece?
I mean, yes, we're tracking the diversity of companies we look at from an investment perspective. We actually have a kind of a list of who we're looking at. Our firm, there's only 15 of us, and most of us have been around for a long time. So we're not doing a lot of hiring, but it's certainly, if we do hiring, it's definitely a consideration. So.
How about for you, Jeff?
Yeah, well, on our side, it's still very early days. I think we are trying to wrap our head around it. I think, we do have an advisory board, and we do have, we kind of have ESG on the radar for our own firm. And there we are at the start of the journey. But then also in terms of the intermediary role we play between the GPs and between the investors, we are trying to incorporate ESG. We've started to, we do a level of matching of investor preferences with characteristics of opportunities we bring to market, and we have incorporated ESG and impact as strategies that the criteria that can be used to do that matching, but it's still it's still a very broad, high level classification at the moment. We are trying to see what type of taxonomies are emerging, what type of metrics the investors are looking for, so that we can incorporate that both into the I suppose classification and descriptions of opportunities, but also into the due diligence that we can put around it. So I'd still say that, I mean, what worked well is that we made the decision to have it firmly on the radar, but I'd still say that we are at the very start of the journey.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'd say any other, advice that you might all give one another, depending on kind of what you just heard about where folks are in the group of things you've learned along the way.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say for any individual organizations that you're thinking of investing in, I mean, I think something we've certainly learned is that if you're looking to make an ESG investment and the organization that you're working with isn't very sophisticated in how they manage data, I feel like that's really telling in terms of how much they actually care about it and are like actively thinking about it. So, if you're asking for specific metrics that they should have and they don't have them or don't have easy access to them, I would read into that what you should.
Interesting. Yeah, that's helpful, Brian. Yeah, Jim or Jeff, any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I think just for us, the fact that we've told our companies this is important to us, I think has resonated with some who kind of, everybody reads about it, so they certainly, but I think in a lot of cases it's easy to say it doesn't apply to me, so people understand, why it's important and push people in the right direction. So
yeah, I mean, I think we've certainly said that, sort of our intention internally, with our new owners from a private equity perspective, the intention is there. But then when we've come to hiring, we've hired people that are in our inner circles already, or we've hired children of some of our, friends of the owner, and so it's been an interesting thing to watch. Again, like you said, the intention we know is there, but it's like when it comes into practice, we don't always see the change unless we're quite intentional about it and continue to bring it up. So yeah, it's not necessarily an easy change that has been made.
Yeah. I think, we would say there has to be some balance. At the end of the day, our companies have to build a great company that, does what we expect them to do. And because, we're both to our investors who are looking for returns to, pay their pensions, to their, former employees or whatever. So
Sure.
we want to definitely, move forward, in all these important areas, but not lose sight of our ultimate objective too. So that's just, so, but yeah, so to your point, Jill, if we've had a company that was successful and had a great exit and the serial entrepreneur came to us and said, we want you guys to fund this for the next one, and they don't fit the exact mold, then we would still fund them. We wouldn't say, sorry,
Sure.
fit our current, DEI, strategy because you're not X, Y, or Z,
Right.
I think for us, it's more, probably the same for you guys, is expanding our network to include people that fit better DEI, priorities. That's our biggest problem. Our network tends not to be, that diverse, as people are looking at today. So, that's our big challenge, is just expanding our network. And, it's not easy. We've reached out in a number of cases and not getting a lot of, positive feedback. So it's something we just have to keep working on. So.
Yeah, good thoughts. Well, I'll finish with just sort of, again, from a next sessions perspective, we're hoping to at least do this once a quarter, but really would love, feedback from all of you in terms of, is the content helpful? Is the format helpful? What suggestions would you have for how we can make this more beneficial to each of you, as well as kind of a broader set of our clients? So I'll ask that question. If folks want to offer up ideas now or do so over email, I'd love to hear.
It'd be interesting to have, if you do have specific aspect of integration with your product that are related to this. I think we discussed it at high level, but it'd be nice to deep dive in some of that as well.
Yeah.
on some of
Absolutely.
those sessions potentially.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, and I would love to see, some actual metrics and real life examples of here's people that have implemented it and sort of gone all the way through the policy practice metrics, and here's kind of what a report looks like with actual metric stuff. It's just,
Okay.
I think it'll be easier for someone who's more of a finance background to understand when I see real statistics, so.
Great. Yeah, it's a good idea. Having maybe a couple folks present sort of, yeah, we've lived it. Here's what we did.
Yeah.
Here's what we learned. Here's what we've changed.
Yeah.
I like
That'd
that.
be great for me.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim.
I think this would be lovely, especially if we make these more regular and we have some similar people that are in groups, but to be able to present problems or questions to the group that we determined before the session, and then spend like 10 minutes or 15 minutes tackling one person's question or challenge that they're facing to try and provide some like real time support on how they can think about the problem differently, or solutions that other folks have had around
I
it.
love that. Okay, great. Yeah, that's helpful, Brian. So yeah, so you're saying you would want to be with peers that are more similar business models to Equitable Facilities, and then be able to share ideas with that group.
Potentially. I mean, to be, I value the diversity of thought though. So
Yeah. Okay.
I think some of the challenges are similar regardless. So
Okay. Yeah, I like that a lot. Okay, great. How about from a cadence perspective? How often would you want to be meeting with small groups or having content fed within our clients? Once a quarter, every other month, every month?
they felt right to me, but yeah.
Quarterly is good, but I mean,
Yeah.
what makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think a lot of it, turn around to you, Jill, a lot of it is if you've got good stuff to share, then,
Sure.
then we don't have to wait 2 months, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Okay. No, that's good feedback. Well, what I'll do, I'm going to share with all of you the slides that we went through today. I'm also going to share the ILPA slides that I mentioned. If, like I said, any of you have questions on those, or want to brainstorm, or want to hear some of the anecdotes or different things that I learned along the way, I'm always happy to be a resource. Like I said, I'm working to stay on top of this and continue to figure out how we can help you all bring this more into the fold. So I'll absolutely keep you posted on the product progress. But if there's anything I can do to be a resource, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
appreciate the dialogue though, guys. Appreciate, yeah, nice conversation, and nice to see all of you.